Thanks for joining me today. My name is Matt Ames, and I'm the Medical Director for Development at HeartWorks. I'm here to provide a basic background and understanding about our organization, what we call HeartWorks Education 101. For a bit of context, I'm a cancer research scientist who spent many years on the staff at Mayo Clinic, and I've been associated with HeartWorks since the early days of the program. Our goals for today are to gain a basic understanding of congenital heart diseases and why they've been such a challenge for modern medicine, to describe key breakthroughs in cell biology that led to the novel cell therapies developed by HeartWorks in the intervening years. We'll then talk a bit about HeartWorks Foundation, how it's structured, how it functions, and why it works so well. And finally, I'll provide a brief status on the update of several of the major products currently being studied and an emphasis on cell-based therapies. I want to begin, however, with a digression, and that's how I met Tim Nelson, the CEO and founder of HeartWorks. For some years at Mayo, I served as the director for research. This is a sort of like a research dean at a university-based academic medical center. And one of the important responsibilities of that position was to chair a group that annually reviewed the more than 100 major research programs and their senior investigators. During that time, I met Dr. Nelson as he was developing his clinical and research interests focused on congenital heart diseases. He asked to meet with me because he was interested in an academic appointment in the research department that I chaired. And from that meeting, I realized quickly that he was a very special talent, and indeed we recruited him to our faculty immediately. In the years since, I've confirmed that Tim is a gifted scientist, a great leader of people and programs, and importantly, a visionary focused on congenital heart diseases and new therapies to treat those diseases. I would argue this is as useful as anything I'll talk to you about today. So congenital heart diseases. These are basically structural defects in the heart, usually the vessels, but it can be valves or chambers, present in about 1 in 100 births. It is congenital. These defects prevent adequate blood flow and cardiac function with these patients. About 1/4 of those patients have life-threatening forms of congenital heart disease requiring early surgeries for survival, and fewer than 1/2 of those 25% of all CHD patients will live to see their 5th birthday. I would note, however, that with proper care, some of these patients reach adulthood, so there are thousands of adults with CHD in addition to the very ill children and infants. The therapies for these diseases are very limited. The surgeries I mentioned earlier, which help the heart but do not repair the structural defects, drugs to lessen symptoms associated with these diseases, and for very few children, heart transplants, not an easy medical task in and of itself. The key point I want to make is that in this era of incredible advances in drug-based research and drug therapies for diseases like cancer, diabetes, GI, and others, there are no single target drugs that will repair a structurally defective heart. These drugs are all focused on a single target that are associated with a disease like cancer or diabetes. That approach simply does not work with congenital heart diseases. So back to Tim Nelson. As a young pediatric cardiologist who focused his career on that 25% of children with the more severe forms of CHD, and in particular, hypoplastic left heart syndrome, or HLHS, where the left side of the heart is not fully formed and cannot properly pump blood to the bodies. So without a series of stage surgeries in early years of life, the prognosis for these patients is very poor. And at just that time, as Tim was focusing his thoughts on the needs for new strategies for therapies, there were some dramatic advances in basic cell biology, which turned out to be critical for Tim and for the HeartWorks therapies that we're talking about today. In brief, scientists learned how to take differentiated cells, fibroblasts from skin or nerves or muscle, and treat those cells in the laboratory with factors that would in fact convert them into pluripotent stem cells. These are cells that can become any type of cell in the body with the right stimulus. And in fact, scientists then developed cocktails to treat those stem cells to indeed convert them into the cell types they were interested in studying, including, importantly for us, cardiac muscle cells or cardiomyocytes. This was landmark work in basic science and cell biology and resulted in a number of Nobel Prizes. From the work I just very briefly described, Tim Nelson took a twofold vision that led to the program that became what we know of as HeartWorks today. First, using the technology I just described, Tim's vision was to develop cell-based therapies using bioengineered heart muscle cells to repair hearts. Secondly, he envisioned taking that bioengineering cell strategy from the research laboratory and scaling it up in quantities and the quality of cells required for clinical use and that would obtain FDA approval to use in patients. With those goals, Tim and his colleagues set out to do just that. And his initial focus was on HLHS and pediatric patients, given his interest as a pediatric cardiologist. And their successful efforts to undertake these goals led to what we knew at the time as the Wanek HLHS program at Mayo Clinic. The Wanek's family support, I must emphasize, from the very beginning through to this present day has been extraordinary and is a fundamental reason why I'm sitting here today talking about HeartWorks. So to briefly summarize those years, Tim and his colleagues developed the facilities, personnel, and technology to prepare clinical-grade, FDA-approved bioengineered cardiac muscle cells from patient cells. And those facilities were approved by the FDA, a major accomplishment. With that capacity, Tim and his colleagues then moved on to early preclinical and then FDA-approved early clinical protocols that we think of as proof of concept studies. These are studies that showed it was actually going to be possible and practical to use these cell-based therapies in patients. And with those efforts, Tim grew the infrastructure necessary to make this complex program function in that setting. As those years moved on, Tim had a realization, though, and basically his next vision, and that was to appreciate that the complexity, scope, and volume of work required to do what he wanted to do went beyond the bounds that are possible for a research program in an academic medical center. Tim and his colleagues simply needed a larger platform to bring all the components required to develop new therapies for congenital heart diseases together in an optimal setting to get those therapies from the laboratory to the patient as quickly as possible. And so this became HeartWorks Foundation, the not-for-profit foundation where in fact now all of the HeartWorks facilities, personnel, manufacturing capability, preclinical and clinical programs live. What is HeartWorks? Fundamentally, it's a platform consisting of a team of teams. Each team is integrated as you would expect any team doing this kind of work to be. But more importantly, there's an emphasis on strong integration across teams, resulting in efficiencies that simply otherwise would not be possible. And this is in fact the core culture at HeartWorks. And the best way to explain this is for me to speak just very briefly about each of the major teams that comprise that platform. First is research and development. As a biomedical research scientist interested in new therapies, in my case cancer therapies, I can tell you that R&D is a critical component of any successful program of this kind. The point is that the therapy that you are focused on today and working very hard at is going to mature, for better or for worse, and you have to have the next therapy, the next strategy ready to go, or you suddenly cease to function. Tim and his colleagues have put together an outstanding R&D team. I would love to talk to you about that, but this isn't really the time or the place today. Next is the preclinical team. The development of any new therapy to treat any disease is based upon the notion that after the laboratory work that you undertake to develop your new strategy and new therapy, you must document safety and activity in preclinical models prior to moving that therapy into the patient. Not only is this the only ethical and logical way to provide, but the FDA will never approve initial phase 1 first-in-human studies, and that approval is required for any new therapy without a rigorous set of preclinical data. HeartWorks has a wonderful preclinical team with great models exactly designed to study what they need for their therapies for congenital heart disease. Next up is manufacturing. This, of course, is the bedrock of all HeartWorks cell-based therapies. It is at this time a standalone facility, Regen Theranostics, developed and headed by Matt Nelson, Tim's co-founder at HeartWorks. You can think of it, we should think of it basically as a factory that produces not cars or widgets, but bioengineered cardiac muscle cells. This required a dramatic scaling up of capabilities from the research laboratory making bioengineered cells to producing hundreds of millions of cells that would meet FDA approval and be ready to go in humans. The FDA has repeatedly approved the facility, and all of the studies using such cells submitted to the FDA have also been approved. The manufacturing facility is a great success of HeartWorks. Next is the clinical trials team. This is really complex, and I'm not going to explain it. What I am going to do is ask you to just think for a second about what's involved in taking a small clump of cells, say a skin biopsy, through a manufacturing process, producing these clinical grade bioengineered cardiac muscle cells, taking them to a clinical setting, a hospital, an outpatient treatment facility, administering those cells safely to a sick patient, and then managing the after components of those patients when they leave. It's very complex. Physicians, surgeons, nurses, cell technicians, people to handle the reams of data that are produced. It's a very complex undertaking. HeartWorks has an outstanding clinical care team, and they also collaborate with other outstanding pediatric centers and hospitals around the country. The last team I'll talk about briefly is the Co-op. This is a relatively new effort at HeartWorks, and one that is becoming increasingly important for the future of HeartWorks. This is basically a database of medical records data from congenital heart disease patients. Those medical records are provided to the Co-op not by HeartWorks reaching out to other medical centers or practitioners, but rather by the proactive approval and enrollment of patients and their families to enter their data into the Co-op. The Co-op database has the ability to go out and reach their records and bring them in securely encrypted, but only at the behest of the patient. Now, the reason Tim and his colleagues developed the Co-op, and it's so important, is that HeartWorks investigators with the data from CHD patients like this have the ability to analyze all aspects of CHD patient data to help design better therapies, to assess the outcomes of prior therapies, either from HeartWorks or elsewhere, and to simply manage this kind of disease and approaches to it moving forward. Medical records collections are common in the United States because any new therapy for any disease requires this kind of thinking. But there is a paucity of data for congenital heart disease patients, and the co-op is rectifying that situation in real time. I would suggest that this is an extremely valuable asset for HeartWorks investigators, and even more valuable to congenital heart disease patients who will benefit from the data analysis that comes out of this kind of work as new therapies move forward. These are the teams directly involved with HeartWorks in terms of the research, manufacturing, all the elements I discussed. There are behind-the-scenes back-office teams as well, and I would only emphasize that the people working on those teams are motivated, committed, and hardworking to the absolute same extent as those on the teams we've talked about today. HeartWorks is a culture that spreads across the entire organization. I want to finish up today by briefly updating you on products under development at HeartWorks with a focus on the cell-based therapies for heart regeneration. And I want to make just a brief comment about using purposely the word products. We think of patients and an environment that is not a business, but taking care of patients at any medical organization. But on the front end, on the product development end, HeartWorks has a culture that says we want to get our new approaches and new therapies from the bench to the bedside as quickly as possible. We want to be aggressive, we want to be focused, and we want to be nimble. Those are attributes often associated with growing businesses. And that kind of culture on the front end of HeartWorks has become part of what HeartWorks really is. We develop products for patients in ways that we think will bring them to the patients sooner than the sort of standard model that a lot of us in academic medicine grew up with. Enough said. Before I talk about the cell studies, I want to mention two other products very briefly. The first is a battery-powered endovascular pump that can be inserted safely into the pulmonary artery for patients with single ventricles who are in urgent need of enhanced oxygenation and blood flow in the body. This device has been tested in several situations, and it can be a lifesaver, and you're going to hear much more about it in the coming months. The second is what you often think of as heart in a box. We call it the second heart. It is a heart kept under physiological and beating conditions in an enclosed system that makes it last outside the body for much longer periods of time. The obvious benefits, of course, is when you're transporting hearts for transplant around the country. But HeartWorks is already assessing and thinking about other uses for this technology, such as repairing the heart outside the body, looking at certain kinds of procedures. It's going to be an important tool and another one that you're going to hear more about in the coming months. I want to focus on the cell-based therapies using patient cells bioengineered to cardiomyocytes to regenerate and strengthen heart muscles in patients with poor cardiac function due to structural defects in the heart. How does this core technology work at this present time as HeartWorks envisions it? First, we obtain patient skin cell biopsies and the fibroblasts that are in those biopsies. And I want to note right there that I said patient's own cells. At the end of the day, this is a transplant. Bioengineered cardiac muscle cells are going to be transplanted to a weakened heart. So you have immune rejection issues unless the cells come from the patient, which at HeartWorks they do. So this is a cell transplant where there are no concerns about immune rejection of the cells or other immunogenic problems. So you have the skin cells and the fibroblasts therein. They go to the manufacturing facilities where they are converted to stem cells. The stem cells are then treated and grown the stem cells are first grown to exponentially larger numbers, and after that, they are converted to the cardiomyocytes and then available for delivery to cardiac muscle in patients in these protocols. Using this technology, the original clinical trial was for pediatric HLHS patients. The study was submitted to the FDA and approved with one caveat. The first cohort of patients will have to be adults with CHD rather than the pediatric patients. This was not an incredible surprise, and it required some modifications, and where we stand now, as you see here, are that there are 2 protocols approved by the FDA. The first protocol was to identify and enroll 100 patients who may well ultimately benefit from this kind of therapy. Those 100 patients have been enrolled, and in fact, HeartWorks has requested the FDA to expand the enrollment, and that may happen soon. Each of those patients will have their skin cell biopsy taken to begin the months-long process of generating the cardiomyocytes. The cells are being processed in the manufacturing facility at a rate dependent upon funding and facility capacity. This gives me the opportunity to say that the approximate cost for each patient processed to skin biopsy cardiomyocytes ready for clinical use is about $100,000. And this is a major goal of current HeartWorks philanthropy. With regard to facility capacity, a second manufacturing facility has just come online at HeartWorks in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and so the capacity to generate the cardiomyocytes is growing substantially. HeartWorks is also studying different means of delivering those cells to hearts in adult patients. In the coming months, we hope to identify the first patients who will acutely need this therapy and who have bioengineered cells available, so it will be possible to proceed with the clinical therapy. To finish up today, I hope I provided you a useful overview of congenital heart disease and HeartWorks, and I want to end by asking, why does it work so well? The first point is really important, and that is that new therapies are desperately needed. As I hope to have convinced you, modern medicine has not served congenital heart disease patients well. Secondly, there are new technologies now available and becoming available that offer real hope for new strategies for new therapies, and that is the focus of HeartWorks. We're in a different era than we were even just a few years ago. The key to all of this at HeartWorks, of course, is the extraordinary people, the outstanding facilities, and the great expertise that are being brought to bear on these diseases and on new therapies. What I haven't emphasized today is the need for investment from friends and donors like all of you. I hope that my description of the current status of cell-based therapies and some of the others, the endovascular pump, the second heart, and there are others, highlight the successes at HeartWorks and make the case that the investments donors have made have been well used. But the cost of bringing these therapies to the patients is simply very, very high. HeartWorks is entirely supported by philanthropy, and so we are dependent on people like you. I want to end by thanking you all for spending time with me today, asking you to consider signing up for our virtual tour, which is very interesting. Tim Nelson will meet with anyone at any time who's interested in talking about HeartWorks. Call him up on it and ask for an appointment. And there are HeartWorks events around the country during the year. Information to how to do all of these activities is available at our online site, as is the process for you to invest in HeartWorks. Thanks again.